Well guys, the 2024 AFL home and away season is done. Another season in the books, and it was an absolutely massive season in terms of crowds. In this video, I am going to be going through the crowd figures for the AFL season in 2024 and also looking at every single club and ranking them on their average home crowd from 18 all the way through to 1. Now, if we look at the AFL as a whole, total crowds through the gates were 7,753,251, and that is a record, the best ever. Obviously, we are playing more games now with gather round, every club playing 23 games, but still a massive result. The average just under 37,500. That is not quite a record in terms of averages. They were sitting at just over 38,000 pre the pandemic, but certainly a record since the pandemic and in terms of total attendees through the gates. And it was a 3.7% increase versus the 2023 season. Now we are going to look at the crowds for every single club from 18 through to 1. Before we get started, I do just want to give a massive shout out to Ponsford Magpie on Big Footy for putting all this data together. He's done an amazing job in terms of collating all this info. Now, before we get into the rankings, I did just want to clear up a couple of things. I do only look at the home crowds because when you look at the home and away crowds, it does distort the data because of the Victorian clubs playing a lot of away games in their home city. It does disproportionately make the non-Victorian clubs look bad in terms of crowds. Just pause the video if you do want to look at the home and away crowds combined for each club. And also, I am going to be excluding gather round in this data because it's not really a fair representation. You do have games being played at small venues and it's not a true home game for those clubs. So it does make the data look a bit wonky. So they aren't going to be considered in these rankings. But let's get right into it. Number 18, the worst attended club for 2024. It was, no surprise, the GWS Giants, an average crowd of around 12,275. No surprise to see the Giants in last place, but it is a big increase on 2023, 19.6%. Crowds are better in Canberra for the Giants than Sydney, but they were starting to crack around 10,000 in Sydney more often than not, which is a good outcome. In number 17, it is the other expansion club, the Gold Coast Suns. 15,584, an increase of around 13.4% on 2023. The Suns, a big year for them, even though they didn't crack the finals. They did win 11 games for the first time in club history. They did get Damien Hardwick. They started the season very well. It was all looking very promising, but they did fall away in the end, as we have seen with the Gold Coast Suns more often than not. You did have 2 games in Darwin getting around 10k or just under, which does make their numbers look a bit bad, but we do know they draw very well, particularly against the big Victorian clubs with that travelling contingent on the Gold Coast. Next up in number 16, it is the first of the Victorian clubs, North Melbourne, 21,954, an increase of around 5.7%. Another tough year for the Kangaroos, but there were some green shoots in terms of those younger players, McKercher, Wardlaw, Sheasel. They did win a few games in the mid stage of the season. You do also have 4 games in Hobart, which just draw terribly down there, around 5 or 6k usually against non-Victorian opposition. The Roos will be exiting that agreement when the Tasmania Devils come in, so those crowds should pick up when they are playing most of their home games in Melbourne, and we would expect the Kangaroos to get a bit better in the following seasons. In number 15, it is the Western Bulldogs, averaging just over 28,600. Pretty much no change on their average crowd from 2023. The Bulldogs played some very exciting footy, particularly in the second half of the year. Probably consider themselves unlucky not to be a little bit higher in terms of ladder position. They do play 2 games in Ballarat, which draw under 10k, so that does bring their average crowd down a bit. It's still not a bad result for the Western Bulldogs. At number 14, it is St Kilda, 29,257. The first club whose average crowd did decrease from 2023. It is understandable. Saints did make finals in 23. They started the season pretty poorly in 2024. They were playing some very unattractive, boring football. But certainly in the last 6 or 8 weeks of the season, they did pick up quite a bit. They were playing some exciting footy. They knocked off the Cats. They knocked off Sydney and also Carlton. And the Saints fans will be hoping that they are back in the mix in 2025. In at number 13, it is the Brisbane Lions, averaging just over 30,800, an increase of around 5.3% on last year. Another pretty good season for the Lions. They did start slowly, but they were looking like likely premiers in the mid to late part of the season. They did lose a couple of games there at the end to finish 5th. They were selling out the Gabba fairly frequently, and they would be hoping to get a new stadium in the early 2030s, depending on what happens with the Brisbane Olympics. We'll watch this space, but I think the Lions, long term, they could be looking at averaging around 40k if they did get a 50k plus stadium and really embedding themselves in southeast Queensland and the city of Brisbane there. Number 12, it is Melbourne, 34,929. A terrible season for the D's. Off field, it all went wrong. On field, it all went wrong. Dropping out of the 8, they did finish in the top 4 last year, obviously went out in straight sets, and it does reflect in their crowds in terms of how poorly they have gone this year. 21.8% decrease in their average home crowd. There was a couple of games against non-Victorian opposition. Port Adelaide and the Giants, they drew under 20k, around 18k from memory. And supposedly that is part of the reason why Christian Petrarca reportedly wants out. He wants to go and play for a Collingwood or a Carlton in front of big crowds. But historically, Melbourne hasn't been a massive drawing club. When they were struggling in the early part of the 2010s, they were drawing pretty horribly. So still a good result when you look at the long term in terms of Melbourne. There was also an Alice Springs home game against Fremantle in there, which would be putting some downward pressure on their average home crowd. At number 11, it is Hawthorn, 36,037, an 8.2% increase on 2023. Wow, the Hawks had a massive year. Started off pretty poorly, 0-5, but they've just taken the competition by storm from around the midway point of the season. They have got themselves back into finals. They were playing some electric footy, high scoring, very offensive, very fun to watch. They do have an exciting young team, so if the Hawks keep going up, we could be seeing their crowds back where they were in those premiership years, 13, 14 and 15. You do also have 4 games in Launceston, which draw a lot better than North Melbourne in Hobart, but still not as good as you are going to get in the MCG. Usually those crowds are anywhere from 10 to 15k in Launceston. Port Adelaide in at number 10, 36,958, down around 1% on 2023. They were top 4 in 23. They also ended up finishing actually better in 2024, coming in at 2nd position on the ladder. But it was a funny year for Port. We remember Ken Hinckley getting booed. They were looking pretty average in the middle part of the season, but they did string together around 7 or 8 wins to finish the season. They did get themselves a home qualifying final. And you never know, this could be the year Ken gets the power into a grand final and maybe even wins it. Number 9, the Sydney Swans, the minor premiers, 38,202, a big increase on last year, 16.3%. What a season for the Swans. They were looking unbeatable up until around round 15, where Fremantle knocked them off at home. They did drop a couple of games in a row there. They did look a bit shaky, but they did steady the ship to finish in first position. Probably still premiership favourites at this stage. And again, the SCG is probably a bit too small for them. Capacity is around 46k, and they are selling it out fairly regularly. Maybe the SCG will be due for an upgrade in the next 5 or 10 years with some of those older stands. And if the capacity can get up to around 52, 54k, we will see the Swans crowds go up even more. Geelong at number 8, 38,837. Another huge increase, 23.7%. We know the new stand at GMHBA Stadium opened in 2024. That increased the capacity of the ground up to 40k. So that does help. They also had a couple of big home games at the MCG, which drew very well. And another pretty good year for the Cats. They missed the finals in 23. They did get back into the top 4 in 2024. And they just keep winning. At number 7, it is the Adelaide Crows. 40,821, plus 5.6%, which is interesting. A pretty bad year for the Crows. They finished bottom 4. They lost their first 4 games of the season. We know obviously last year was very exciting. They almost got in the 8. You did have the situation with Ben Keys and that goal umpiring decision late in the season against Sydney, which probably cost them finals in the end. But it is nice to see the Crows up 5.6%. I would expect that probably drops next year unless they shoot up the ladder. But certainly a very well supported club. Lots of fans. They are very loyal, even though they haven't really had any major successes in the past 20-25 years. Number 6, it is the West Coast Eagles, averaging 46,234. An increase of 9.4%. Eagles fans have got to be some of the most loyal in the league. It is a massive club, very well supported. We know how bad they have been in the past 3.5 years. Last year, particularly winning the wooden spoon, only winning 2 or 3 games from memory. But this year, you had Harley Reid come in. He brought probably a lot of people through the gates in and of himself. They had a couple of big wins against Melbourne and Fremantle at home. Plenty of poor performances as well for the Eagles. I don't think they're through their rebuild at all. But it does speak volumes about the loyalty of the fan base to still get such a massive average home crowd, despite the on-field product being pretty average to say the least. Number 5, it is Fremantle, the other West Australian team, beating out Big Brother for the second time in a row. 46,891 average home crowd, an increase of 6.3%. The Dockers got over 40k to every home game this year, which is a great result. It was looking like a very promising season for the Dockers, but they did drop away significantly in the last month, going from 3rd to 10th, missing finals, losing their last 4 games. Very heartbreaking for the fan base. It'll be interesting to see whether they rebound next year in terms of getting back up into the top 8 or the top 4. Maybe you will have some excitement around Shea Bolton and maybe Liam Baker or a couple of other trade targets, but I do think the Dockers might see a slight decrease in terms of crowds next year. Number 4, the Wooden Spooners Richmond. Massive result, 47,582, an average home crowd. It did drop by around 7.5% on last year, but no surprise they did only win the 2 games for the year. Not much to get excited about for Tigers fans, but they did turn out in massive numbers. It is going to be a long rebuild for the Tigers. They are going to be losing quite a lot of key players in the off-season, but they will be getting some exciting youngsters with a strong draft hand, especially if Bolton and Baker end up going to Freo or maybe West Coast in Baker's case. They are probably going to have 2 or 3 first-round picks, so they will get some exciting youngsters in, but the Tigers probably going to be down the bottom of the ladder for the next 3 or 4 years. You won't see the crowds get quite as high as they did in their glory days, but still very well-supported club. They will turn out rain, hail or shine. Number 3, it is Essendon, 50,478, an increase of 8% on 2023. Another frustrating year for the Bombers. In the first half of the year, they were looking very good. They did get themselves entrenched in the top 4. It was the same old story though, unfortunately. Fell away in the second half of the year and missed finals again. You do have to remember though, with Essendon, they do play 5 or 6 home games at Marvel Stadium, and with the configuration of how they allocate the tickets with the Medallion Club at that stadium, you're rarely going to see crowds of over 40k at Marvel. So to finish at around 50k is a great result because of those MCG crowds being so high. Number 2, it is Carlton, 58,311, an increase of 13.3% on 2023. Well, the Blues were looking like serious premiership contenders for most of the year, but they did have a lot of injuries. They did fall away quite a bit, almost missed finals, but Port Adelaide knocked off Fremantle in the last game of the year. Massive result in terms of crowds for the Blues. Like the Bombers, they do play a lot of home games at Marvel, where you're really only going to get 40k at a maximum. So those MCG crowds, again, carrying the Blues to 2nd position in the AFL. And number 1, no surprise, it is Collingwood, 66,879, an increase of 1.9% on 2023. We know the Pies finished as premiers in 2023. They did finish on top of the ladder. So to see the crowds even go up after that is an amazing result. Not quite the year the Pies fans would have hoped for. Started off pretty poorly. They looked really good in the middle of the season. You did think they were going to finish top 4 again, but they did fall away at the end of the year with injuries and also form. But still an amazing result. 66,000 average home crowd is just bonkers. you did have at least one, if not two, home games at Marvel Stadium in there as well. So you can imagine if they played all their home games at the MCG, how high that would be. So that is just a look at the crowds in 2024, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.